What's up everyone, welcome back to TechCravers. Today we're taking a look at one of the most interesting retro handhelds Anbernic has released so far, the Anbernic RG477V. And at first glance, this thing looks like a classic vertical handheld, but don't let that fool you. Under the hood, the RG477V is running Android, powered by a seriously capable Dimensity 8300 chipset, and it's clearly aiming much higher than just old school emulation. You got a 4.7-inch 4x3 touchscreen, which is basically perfect for retro systems, a high refresh rate panel, Hall effect sticks, active cooling, and enough performance headroom to push well beyond the usual limits of vertical handhelds. This isn't just about Game Boy and SNES, I'm talking about Android gaming, cloud streaming, and demanding emulators, all in a compact, pocket-friendly form factor. So the big question is, does the RG477V actually deliver, or is it just another spec sheet monster? Well, let's break it down, starting with the design and build quality. Roll the intro. Alright, let's do a quick unboxing and see what we actually get. And inside the box, things are kept very simple. You get the Anbernic RG477V itself, a small quick start guide or manual, and a USB-A to USB-C charging cable. And that's it. No extras, no screen protector, no carrying case, nothing else is in the box, straight to the point. Now, taking the handheld out for the first time, this is the retro grey version, and honestly it looks really clean. One thing you immediately notice is that the entire front is covered in glass, not just the screen itself. That gives it a much more premium and modern look, especially compared to older plastic front handhelds. The downside, of course, is that it's more prone to fingerprints and smudges, and you probably want to be a bit more careful with it, or throw on a screen protector if you're planning to travel with it. But in the hand, the device feels solid and well built. It's not overly heavy, but it definitely doesn't feel cheap either. The buttons are clicky, the sticks feel smooth, and overall you can feel that Anbernic has put some thoughts into this. The shoulder buttons are parallel, which is usually what you see on vertical handhelds, and they are very clicky. You definitely get clear feedback when you press them. At the same time, they're easy to reach and it feels natural to rest your index fingers on them while playing. Nothing feels awkward or cramped here, and I can imagine it's the same even during longer sessions. The unit they sent me is the 12GB of RAM and 256GB of storage version, but we'll get back to specs and performance a bit later in the video. As a first impression though, this feels like a serious vertical handheld, not just like a nostalgia device. The screen stands out right away, the layout feels familiar, and everything about it suggests that it's built for more than just basic retro gaming. Before we dive deeper, here's a quick size comparison. And I should mention that I'm traveling right now, so I only have two other handhelds with me to compare it with. First up is the Thor, which is a dual-screen clamshell device with dimensions around 150 by 94 by about 25mm, and it sits around 380 grams. It's surprisingly compact for a dual screen, but you can immediately feel there's more to it in your pocket. Then there's the Odin 3, a more traditional horizontal Android handheld. This one is significantly longer at about 224 by 87.5 by 16mm, and tipping the scales closer to 390 grams. Compared to both, the Anbernic RG477V sits in at an interesting middle ground. It's taller than the Thor and shorter than the Odin 3 at roughly 153 by 105 by 23mm. And it feels lighter and more compact in your hands. Because of the vertical form, it doesn't feel bulky and it's easier to wrap your hands around than the wider landscape device like the Odin 3. So if you're picturing where the RG477V sits in size, this should give you a good idea. But alright, let's talk some specs, and I'll keep this quick. The RG477V runs Android 14, which means full access to emulators, apps, and modern Android games. Powering everything is the MediaTek Dimensity 8300 paired with a Mali G615 GPU, giving this vertical handheld way more performance than you normally expect from this form factor. My unit here comes with 12GB of LPDDR5X RAM and 256GB of fast internal storage with support for microSD cards up to 2TB. But there are also a cheaper version with 8GB of RAM and 128GB of internal storage. Up front, you're looking at a 4.7-inch LTPS touchscreen with a 4:3 aspect ratio, a 1280 by 960 resolution and a refresh rate of up to 120Hz, which is honestly perfect for retro games and smooth UI navigation. There's a 5500 mAh battery inside charging over USB-C, and you also get a DisplayPort out if you want to hook this up to an external display. For connectivity, it supports Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.3, and you got Hall effect sticks, built-in gyro, vibration, a 3.5mm headphone jack, and active cooling with a fan and heat pipe. So yeah, spec-wise, this is a seriously powerful vertical handheld, and next we'll see how all of this actually performs in real-world gaming. So let's start with some Game Boy, Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance. And performance-wise, this is obviously no problem at all. These systems run perfectly, but what really matters here is how they fit on the screen. Game Boy and Game Boy Color both have a 10:9 native aspect ratio, which means on the RG477V's 4:3 display you get black bars on the sides. They're not huge, but they are there. And the upside is that the image stays completely accurate with no stretching or distortion. Game Boy Advance is a bit different. It uses a 3:2 aspect ratio, so here you end up with thin black bars at the top and bottom instead. Again, scaling looks really clean and the image fills the screen nicely without breaking the original proportions. Thanks to the 1280 by 960 resolution, pixel art looks sharp and well defined. Text is easy to read and everything just looks clean, whether you're playing slower paced games or fast action titles. And combined with the vertical form factor, this just feels like a very natural way to play classic handheld games. So for GB, GBC and GBA, the RG477V delivers exactly what you want. Accurate aspect ratios, great scaling and really nice viewing experience. Next up, let's move on to some retro systems that really take full advantage of this gorgeous 4:3 display, starting with SNES, Nintendo 64 and Nintendo DS. SNES is pretty much a perfect match here. It runs at a native 4:3 aspect ratio, which means it fills the screen beautifully with no black bars, no stretching and no compromises. Pixel art looks sharp, colors pop, and this is honestly one of the best ways to play 16-bit games on a modern handheld. Nintendo 64 is another great fit. Just like SNES, N64 was designed for 4:3 displays, so games scale really nicely on the RG477V. You get a big image, correct proportions and a smooth gameplay. It just feels right on a screen like this. One thing to note about the button layout, however, is that the D-pad sits above the left analog stick, and because of that, games that rely heavily on the analog stick for steering can feel a bit more cramped than games that mainly use the D-pad. That said, since the handle is as wide as it is, using the analog stick still feels fairly natural most of the time. It's not uncomfortable, and once you adjust your grip a bit, it doesn't feel nearly as awkward as you might expect. So while this layout clearly favors D-pad focused games, analog heavy titles are still very playable thanks to the overall size and ergonomics of this device. Nintendo DS is a bit more interesting. Because it's a dual screen system, you got a few layout options, but on a 4:3 display like this, it actually works really well. You can stack the screens vertically, prioritize the main screen, or use a picture-in-picture layout depending on the game, and everything remains clear and usable. Thanks to the sharp resolution and the vertical form factor, DS games are very comfortable to play here, especially for titles that don't rely heavily on constant dual screen interaction. So for SNES, N64 and Nintendo DS, the RG477V really shows its strengths. This is exactly the kind of screen these systems were made for. But alright, let's move on to GameCube, and this is where the RG477V really starts to flex. I'm playing Mario Kart Double Dash, Wind Waker, F-Zero GX and SSX3 in this footage, and the performance here is honestly excellent. These games run at full speed and you can comfortably bump the internal resolution up 2 times native and in some cases even 3 times depending on the title. And what really elevates the experience though is the 4:3 aspect ratio. GameCube games were designed for this format, and on the RG477V they fill the screen perfectly. No stretching, no black bars, just a big clean image that looks absolutely fantastic. Wind Waker in particular looks gorgeous here, with high resolution scaling making the art style really pop, and even fast-paced games like F-Zero GX stay smooth and incredibly sharp. And at this point, hardware performance isn't really the limiting factor anymore. If you do run into issues with certain GameCube titles, it's almost always down to the emulator and not the hardware itself. Overall, GameCube emulation on the RG477V is rock solid, and the combination of power and proper 4:3 screen makes these games look and feel amazing. Next up is PlayStation 2, and the story here is very similar. Most games run really well on the RG477V, and you can push the resolution 2 times native without any problem. And depending on the game, even 3 times native is absolutely doable. Once again, the 4:3 display plays a huge role here. Most PS2 games were designed for this aspect ratio, and seeing them fill the screen properly makes a massive difference compared to wider displays with black bars or scaling compromises. Burnout 3 feels incredibly smooth and sharp at higher resolutions, and God of War 2 looks surprisingly clean and detailed on this screen. It's honestly impressive for a vertical handheld. And just like with GameCube, if you ever hit performance issues, it's far more likely to be an emulator limitation rather than a lack of power from the hardware. So for PS2 emulation, the RG477V delivers a very consistent, high-end experience, and the 4:3 screen really helps these games shine. Nintendo 3DS emulation using Citra also works perfectly fine performance-wise on the RG477V. There are no issues there at all. Where things get a bit more complicated is the aspect ratio. Natively, the 3DS uses a 15:9 top screen and a 4:3 bottom screen, and on a single 4:3 display that's always going to be a bit more of a compromise. On top of that, most 3DS games rely more heavily on the bottom screen than Nintendo DS games do, which makes screen layout even more important here. That said, Anbernic has actually done a nice job with their default Citra configuration. You get both screens visible at the same time, along with a clean 3DS style skin and bezels, which helps make the experience feel more complete even with both screens on display. And of course, if you prefer, you can always switch to a single screen layout if you want, and map a screen swap button and play it that way instead. So while 3DS isn't a perfect match for a 4:3 screen, the performance is excellent and you still have enough flexibility to make it work the way you prefer. Alright, CMU emulation time, and that means Wii U. Performance-wise, Wii U games actually run surprisingly well on the RG477V. Gameplay is smooth, frame rates are solid, and from a pure performance standpoint, this device has no problem keeping up. The real issue here isn't performance, it's the aspect ratio. Wii U games are designed around a 16:9 display, and on the RG477V's 4:3 screen, that means the image ends up squeezed in with fairly thick black bars on top and bottom. Even though it's genuinely impressive to see how well these games run on a vertical handheld, I personally have a hard time seeing myself actually playing a lot of Wii U on the RG477V, simply because the games don't fit the screen in a satisfying way. And yes, you can stretch the image to make it fit, but honestly it just doesn't look good, and it takes away from the experience. So while Wii U emulation here is technically very capable, the 4:3 display just isn't a great match for these games, at least in my opinion. And it's almost exactly the same with Nintendo Switch. Just like with Wii U, the aspect ratio is part of the problem here. Switch games are built for 16:9, so on the RG477V's 4:3 screen you end up with fairly small image and thick bars, which already makes the experience less immersive. But this is also where the Dimensity chip finally starts to bottleneck. Since there are no custom firmwares to rely on here, we're stuck with the native performance, and that really defines what's playable and what's not. Lighter to run games like Silksong and Hades 2 will work perfectly fine, they run smoothly and are genuinely playable. But once you move over to heavier titles, you know, the red guy with the mustache or the green dinosaur, things fall apart pretty quickly. Those games either don't run at all, or they run so poorly that they're just not in a playable state. So while it's cool to see Switch games running at all on this device, between the performance limits and the 4:3 display, it's not something I'd personally come here for. Alright, before we wrap this up, let's quickly go through pricing and availability. The Anbernic RG477V is available right now from Anbernic's official website. Prices start at around $200 for the base model, and the 12GB RAM and 256GB storage version, like the one I'm using here, usually lands somewhere around $240 to $250 depending on sales and promotions. For what you're getting, a powerful Dimensity chip and a really nice 4:3 high refresh rate screen, the pricing actually makes a lot of sense. I will leave a link in the video description if you're interested to check it out, and just so you know, if you use that link, I do earn a small commission at no extra cost to you. It's a simple way to support the channel, and honestly, it's a win-win. Alright, that's gonna do it for this video, and first of all, thank you for sticking around and watching all the way to the end. After spending some proper time with it, I can honestly say that the Anbernic RG477V is, at least right now, my favorite vertical handheld. Anbernic really nailed so many things here: the screen, the performance, the overall feel, and especially that 4:3 display, which just works incredibly well for the systems this device is clearly made for. Now, it's not perfect, it does have a few flaws, but the important thing is that the RG477V more than makes up for them, especially when you look at the price. Compared to something like the Aya Neo Pocket Vert, which cost about $100 more without offering any real performance gains, the RG477V just feels like a much smarter buy. So if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, it really helps out the channel, and if you want to see more handheld reviews like this in the future, make sure to subscribe. And feel free to drop a comment down below if you got any questions, or if you're already using the RG477V yourself. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.